Forward.
Okay. Oh,
Forward.
oh dear, I hear the Facebook thing. Oh dear, I hear the Facebook. Okay, how's that? It's off. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Earth Exchange Cafe. My name is Trebby Johnson, and I am the founder and director of Radical Joy for Hard Times. And this is our monthly conversation where we are able to talk with somebody whose work has inspired and influenced that of Radical Joy for Hard Times. And sometimes somebody who has actually participated in some really interesting ways with Radical Joy for Hard Times' work. And our guest today is both of those, a participant, an inspiration, and a really, really deep and interesting person. And we call this the Earth Exchange Cafe because we invite you to just settle in and imagine that you're in a beautiful little cafe filled with books and magazines and tables arranged in ways that invite conversation. So we're here, you're here, maybe you have a cup of coffee or tea or chocolate with you, and you're here with friends. And you're here to explore some of the questions that we all think about, we care about, and that we often don't get a chance to talk about. Questions that have to do with grief and beauty and art, about living and dying and how to live more meaningfully while being aware of the fact that we are mortal and that the earth is mortal and that all things arise and disappear. So for the next hour or so, we invite you to just settle back and relax. And we're going to be having a conversation today with Meredith. Unfortunately, my co-host on this program, Harriet Sams, is unable to be with us because she has a wretched case of the flu. And so she checked in just to say hello, and then she went and crawled back into her bed again. But so she will be back next month with us. So I'm really, really happy today to introduce Meredith Little Foster. She and her husband, Stephen Foster, co-founded Rites of Passage Incorporated in 1976, and then in 1981, the School of Lost Borders. And with these two organizations, both of which are still running, they pioneered new methods and dynamics of modern cross-cultural rites of passage in the wilderness, creating innovative practices in the field of ecotherapy. Meredith has dedicated her life to returning meaningful and culturally appropriate rites of passage ceremonies to all people in support of the natural cycles of living and dying necessary for healthy lives and a healthy world. Since Stephen's death in 2003, she continues both nationally and internationally to guide and train others. She co-founded a new branch of Lost Borders called the Practice of Living and Dying to help break taboos and silences that pervade the subject of death, and to help restore dying to its natural place in the cycles of life. She and Stephen have co-authored several books about wilderness rites of passage, and she's the author most recently of a book of her own called A Love Story, which is a book about her and Stephen's work and the process of Stephen dying. And I myself am honored and delighted to have known and been Meredith's friend for many years. So Meredith, welcome, and welcome to the Earth Exchange Cafe.
Oh, it's so good to see you, Trevi. I'm happy to be with you.
Thank you. So let's just dive in. Let's dive into the hard part, which is also the root of what you've been doing with your work in the last few years. For you, the professional and the personal and the spiritual have been very much interwoven in your life. And over the last couple of decades, that has led you to create the practice of living and dying. So can you tell us how Stephen's death and his dying process brought you to this new work?
Well, the last work that Stephen and I were doing was talking about how can we bring this to people who are facing life-threatening illnesses, because that's where Stephen was. And so it was, as Stephen's illness progressed, more and more we wanted to see how we can bring the work that we'd been doing for so many years into the world of physical dying. And truthfully, when he died, the next 4 or 5 years, as you know, Trevi, I learned more about what a rite of passage was than all the years I've been working to watch my own process of just trying to keep moving in through the loss and grief, and what it took to really let go of. I died to what was when Stephen died. It was so clear that was gone, and how to move into the new world, find my own feet in that. And during that time, the only thing I really wanted to talk about was to talk with people about death. And so the practice of living and dying was not only in order to help me be with people who were willing to talk about it, but also the bringing together, trying to bring together the worlds of what do people who have been sat with people who are physically dying, what have they learned, and what have people who have guided those who are symbolically dying, like a rite of passage, what do they teach each other about how to really support people who are in major life change, whether it's symbolic death or physical death.
So why is it important for people who are, living pretty healthy, maybe they haven't had a death in their life of a close person? Why is it important to think about death and dying?
Well, I think in these last several generations, the taboo of talking about death became stronger and stronger because of many reasons that I don't need to go into. But mirrored by the taboo about talking about physical death was the ability of us to realize the importance of symbolically dying to what was in order to keep moving into the life that we are growing into. And the role modeling about how to be able to go into those hard places within us, into the place where we have to feel the grief of letting go and the change of really looking at our own shadow side, was not well role modeled. And so in order to, in a healthy way, continue to mature into who we're becoming, it takes the ability to do the hard work of going inside and grieving the losses and making it good with our people. And so both those being a kind of taboo, going into the shadow or talking about physical death, it makes it challenging to deal with all the changes that are happening in our world today, happening so fast. And in order to truly integrate what that means, how that impacts who we are, we have to be willing to learn how to go into the shadow side, go into the grief and the loss, and learn how to die to who we were before, the self-identities that no longer work, and to grow into who we are becoming as we become more aware of the truth of what's happening in the world around us. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I have an explosion of questions. So I'll just ask one. Is there something that the people who come to the practice of living and dying programs, is there something that they have in common? Is there something they're seeking?
Well, for many of them, it's, and especially in the beginning, it was elderly people who were from 50s, 60s, 70s, who felt that threshold of physical death coming closer. And or it was people who had loved ones in their family who were getting close to dying, and they found very few places where they could talk about how to do that, how to support people who are physically dying. And then more and more in these last years, it's also the younger generation who in many ways are looking at, you hear them say, maybe we need to learn how to hospice a dying world, and who are really looking, or are more capable of going inside into the shadow places and wanting to do that because it's being, because we're learning how to do that hard work. And the younger generations are much more savvy and aware of the importance of transition and turning into transition, and want to talk about physical death, those things which have been not talked about. I can remember Selene, my daughter, when she became a teenager, she just wanted to wear black, right? The phase when it's all black, it's like the younger generation saying, in your face, you don't want to talk about death, we are going to take it on. And so I'm seeing the younger generations who are saying, we want to talk not only about physical death, but about the changes in the world that mean we have to die to some of the moral values and morals and basic assumptions that we've been raised with, and so that we can really learn how to step into this new world cleanly.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's, as what I have learned from the young people at the Wilderness Guides Council, which is the organization that emerged out of your and Stephen's work 25 years ago or so. A lot of young people are much more able to look at the reality of climate change and what it is going to bring than a lot of adults who say, oh, well, we can still stop it, or we can stave it off, or let's not talk about it, or, all kinds of ways of not going to that dark place. So, so it's fascinating that young people are coming to talk about death and dying.
Yeah, it is. And it's, in some ways it's no surprise. For one, back in the beginning in the 60s, before 1960, there were hardly any books at all about death and dying. And of course, we go to the library today, and there are many, many, many books. It began to be changed in the 60s. But for those of us who were raised in these past generations, we just didn't go there. It was the message was to go inside to those dark places. If you feel the grief and pain that often is waiting for us there, it'll kill you. Don't go there. It's dangerous. That's the message we were brought up with. And our young people are now being brought up with, it's changing the message, thank God, maybe partly because of our generation saying that's not okay. They are learning how to navigate those rich places that we find when we do go inside and we do look at the grief and the loss. They're tapping the wisdom of that place, which to me, I just keep learning from them. I need to hear the voices of our younger generation because they have a lot of the message that we need, as you say, about how to deal with a world that is really frightening to step into.
So talk about some of those places that are life affirming, that arise out of the darkness, and that you've seen in yourself, or that you've seen in somebody else who's been on one of your programs.
Say a little more about what you're asking.
Well, I mean, you spoke about the gifts that come out of the darkness. And so what are some of those? If people haven't experienced themselves, like what what are some examples of realizations that people have had or transformations that they've had as a result of going into those dark places?
Well, I think for one, to recognize that we are always becoming, that we are not something we don't, that whole, the change, the shift that it necessitates from linear to cyclical understanding is probably one of the biggest shifts that we can make in stepping into this new paradigm. That we don't, we're not just born and then we live and we learn and we become wise and we find the answers and then we die. Instead, that sense that we are always growing into new awareness, and that's not a bad thing, that's an exciting thing, that's to discover that I remember one time for a year or two, I began to ask guides, what's the biggest thing you've learned from being a guide? And one of them said that we're able to die. And that sense that we're capable of doing the dying to what was in order to mature into who we are becoming with the new knowledge and awareness that's around us, that's exciting. It's like there's a possibility of realizing that, for one, I don't have to have all the answers. I don't have to be perfect. That instead, the cyclical message is that we are human beings who are fallible. We learn from our mistakes, that we are grown by our mistakes, that it's not, the goal is not linear to become perfect, but it's to become whole and embrace the the wounded places as much as the new awarenesses that changes us. How many times have I gotten a letter from someone who said, just reading the book of the Vision Quest, like, oh, now I understand what I've been going through. Now I have a name for it. Now I can put meaning to this traumatic experience that I have. I see that it was a rite of passage for me, and it brings more meaning into the inevitable changes, major shifts and transitions that we have in our human life.
And it's true. It's like, because I've guided these rites of passage trips for many years, and the kinds of things that you're talking about that dying means, it's not just a planet dying or a person dying. It's like a form of behavior dies, like somebody comes in and says, I've been addicted to such and such a thing for all of these years, and now I'm doing a ceremony and I'm letting it go. I've been addicted. I've been in a relationship. It doesn't work. I have to acknowledge that it needs to die. It's like this constant shifting of who we are into the world, and a constant becoming. Yeah.
And to be with people who are willing to talk about that and the grief of it and the excitement of it is, we don't find that again much. These younger generations are doing it, but in our generation, you just don't talk about that. If you're unhappy, you got to make your friend happy. I mean, if your friend is unhappy, our goal, our role is to make them happy again. It's not to say, I'm with you, something's happening. I'll walk with you through this dark place. This is good. Something important is happening. Instead, the message is don't go there. And that just cuts us off from the potential of continuing to mature as we grow into all the changes of our life.
I realized today when I was thinking about our conversation that it was in a way, it was death, or a conversation about death, that brought you and Stephen together in the very beginning because of how you met. So could you talk about that, talk about your meeting and how that led you into creating the work that you did?
Well, I was working at the Suicide Prevention Center, and I had an all-night shift. And they asked me to be a part of the training program, and Stephen was a part of the training program, and they couldn't figure him out. They said he's really good, but he doesn't follow any of the rules. And so they decided to put him on my shift. And so for over a year, we would meet, from 11 to 7 in the morning and talk with people who are dying. And Stephen began to tell me about the work that he was doing, taking young people out into the desert and trying to find ways of creating meaningful ways for young people to mark their passing from childhood to adulthood, and recognizing how important that was he was an English professor, from the many myths and stories and the literature, the poetry that had so much about life, ceremonies of transition, especially from youth to adult. And we were talking about how these people who were calling us on the phone, they didn't really want to die. They just didn't know how to do the work of letting go of, and doing the hard work of letting go of the old story of who they were and making it good with some of the things that they felt badly about, in order to move into a new phase. And that what they needed was a symbolic dying. And so it was at that point that we decided to try to bring that to young people, especially. And, Stephen was always fascinated by death. He flirted with it a lot. And one of the time when we committed our lives together was when my father was dying. And we went to where he lived in Florida. And it was one of the first, this is back in the early 70s, when dying at home was not done anymore. You die in a hospital. And yet in my family, Ginny, my stepmother, made it possible for my father to die at home. And to be a part of that process of being with him in those last days was life-changing. And again, for Stephen and I, we at that point committed our lives together, and to bring rites of passage and symbolic, to bring the ceremony of which we saw my father going through as he was dying, wanting to make it good with his people and wanting a life review. We saw these steps, if you watch people approaching their physical death, that were very similar to the process of being able to move into a life transition, symbolic death. We saw that the process was very similar. And that influenced us a lot about the work that we began to do. Ginny, my stepmother, was a cultural anthropologist and began to bring us a lot of literature about the pancultural ways of rites of passage and how integral it was to cultures, and how our society in our country just didn't have ways of doing that, and how important it felt to bring that to young people especially.
Yeah, and before we started the program today, you and I were talking about how this work has spread. You and Stephen started this in the early 70s, and now there are hundreds of guides in the US and all over. South Africa, Ukraine, France, Germany, England, Switzerland. It's become, the panculture has become pancultural again.
Yeah, it's not only our country that has lost the connection to ceremony, rites of passage, but it's like that. How do we return it to the land? Return it to the land around the world. There are some places that still have semblances of it, but really in most parts of the world, that way of connecting with the land and bringing ceremony back to the land, meaningful ceremony back to the land, is important to culturally appropriately bring it back to their land and to their people and to their culture, and finding ways of making it relevant to the world today. That's big work. And there's some wonderful, the people who are attracted, like you, Trevi, who are attracted to this work are amazing people. It has me trust this process so much, because the people who are drawn to it are amazing and capable of really understanding what that means to bring it back into their culture.
Yeah, because it feels so real. Well, so one of the aspects of the Rites of Passage program, that you and Stephen developed and then is now practiced all over the world, was the Death Lodge. So before you started doing your own work with death and dying after Stephen's death, or starting really while he was still alive, was the Death Lodge, which is recommended on all the different kinds of Rites of Passage programs. So could you tell us a little bit about that, and why it's important and what it leads to for people?
Where originally that comes from, the language was from Jaime Storm, who in the 70s called us to him and began to teach us some of the ways of his own people. And one night when my stepmother Ginny was preparing to die, and we said to him, do your people have any way of supporting people who are physically dying?
And he was, which was the First Nation he was from?
From the Cheyenne. He was
Cheyenne.
Part Cheyenne and part German, and grew up on the reservation. Okay. And he said, of course we do. And he began to tell us about the ball court, but most important, how the teaching of the ball court in Central America was brought into his community. And he first introduced us to those 4 steps that were necessary in order to surrender into a dying. And that was Decision Road. I am dying, to actually admit and acknowledge the truth of that, which in our generations was not done. You'd pretend no one's dying. Second one was Death Lodge, the making it, when someone was announced to be in their death lodge, the people knew this is the time to make it good with them. This is the last opportunity. And also for the dying person to say what they needed to say, forgiveness, love, thank you, to their people, that there was a need to do that in order to surrender into their dying. And the last one was what he called Purpose Circle, which is then being beyond our social karma and being making good with ourselves, and realizing that people who are, if you sit with someone who's physically dying, like we saw with my father back in the early 70s, this was, you don't have to say, now it's time for you to do your death lodge. This is what happens as people get closer. You often will say, this person should have died, weeks ago. Why are they still alive? And someone will knock on the door, someone important to the person who's dying. They will say something. It might be, with my father, it was just a few sentences expressing deep love and friendship. And then he'd go off and somewhere else that was unapproachable. He was making it good with his social karma, the need to say, I love you, thank you, I'm so sorry, I forgive you. And then the Purpose Circle for the Cheyenne Nation, it was putting the person who was dying then, if we were beyond social karma, just outside the village, and one person who would bring them water and oversee them, and they were making it good with themselves. Could they get to the point of looking honestly at their life and what they did and what they didn't do, and their regrets and their dreams that were lived or not lived, and be able to get to the point of saying it was good enough. It was good enough. And with someone who's dying, that sense they begin to tell the stories of their life, especially if we can sit and say, tell us, who are you? Who have you been? The yearning to be able to look at their life and say it had meaning. With Stephen, I remember, he would say, I haven't done enough in my life. I didn't really make the imprint that I wanted to. And he was really depressed that, who am I now? I've died to all the self-identities that I thought I was, and am I important at all? So I brought him his boxes of his old journals, and for months he would read through his old journals, and he came and he said, I've done a lot.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and it makes that, instead of holding on for I haven't done enough, it's the need to do that in order to let go into the death.
Yeah.
And that's symbolic as well as physical, those steps.
And it's quite an extraordinary process. I mean, because when people on the programs that I've guided have done a death lodge, they've had some really profound experiences, because you're in a world where, you're fasting, you've been alone for 4 days. The world is different. Your mind slows down. You become more absorbed by the place where you are. And people have had conversations of forgiveness. They didn't force it at all. It came naturally. There was just sort of this sense of a presence of somebody who wanted to be there when you're lying there in your death lodge on pine boughs or in a gully or something in a canyon. And words are spoken that are extremely profound and magical, and who knows how it happens. But it's not the thing that's extraordinary about all of these ceremonies is they last. They have a lasting impact. It's not just here and gone, and then you wake up and it's like, oh well, that was nice, but now I'm back to where I was.
Yeah, it seems to, it's sort of amazing to me. I don't understand it. I don't want to understand it, but it makes a shift when they go home with that relationship with the person. It shifts the relationship. And
It does.
yeah, it's amazing to me too. Ceremony is amazing to me.
Or even when they're dead. I mean, I did a ceremony at the Great Ball Court, which I'm going to ask you to talk about, a conversation with my father, who was an alcoholic, very abusive to my mother. And your co-guide, Scott, suggested I have a conversation with him and hear his story from his point of view.
Mm-hmm.
It was so profound. It absolutely, after 60 some years of feeling resentful and angry at my father, it absolutely transformed it into compassion. And it's lasted. Well, that was like 6 or 7 or 8 years ago. Extraordinary.
It is. And I think, it also points out the role of ceremony, in that no doubt you for years worked on your relationship with your father. And yet there's something, we can do it from our head. We can, have rational understanding, or we can do it from our heart. But there's something, ceremony allows us to do that with our wholeness. It's like we really, all of us is, and so often people will go into the death lodge thinking, oh man, I've got all this anger I've got to deal with. And it doesn't come. And they realize they've been holding on to this story for so long that they're angry at so-and-so. And actually, they haven't had a way of stopping and saying, is it really the same story? And often the story has already changed, but we have to catch up with it. And that makes all the difference. Like
That's
you
great.
said. Yeah.
The story has changed, but we have to catch up with it. That's a wonderful way of thinking about it. So you mentioned Great Ball Court. I mentioned the Great Ball Court. What is the Great Ball Court?
So when Storm talked to us that night about the teaching about death, and talked about it coming from this particular story coming from the Mayan people in Central America, we began to research that. There are, and realize there are stories and myths and fairy tales around the world that actually express very similar teaching, because it's a universal kind of teaching. But this particular one was sort of on our land, in this continent, and is based on the book, the Popol Vuh, which is like the Mayan Book of the Dead. And we began to dive into the teaching of that story, and decided that the first time we tried it was back in 1980. And it was saying, let's see if we can, instead of, let's have the intent that everybody shares in this ceremony be the intent of, I am dying to who I was, I'm dying to my life up to this point, and to take a good 6 months to a year to do the final work of really being able to, the hard work of letting go of who I was and what needs to be let go of, and make it good with my people and as best I can. And then to come together for the threshold part of the ceremony, which was the 4 days and nights of living alone, each day dedicated to the final work of day 1, Decision Road, day 2, Death Lodge, all days dedicated to Death Lodge, day 3 dedicated to the purpose circle, making good with ourselves and our God, and then having a day of being able to live in between. I've died to what was, and I haven't yet stepped into the new. And we wanted to see what sharing that intent, what it evoked, and if it was fertile, because as we know, a myth or a story or fairy tale, if its intent is to drop us into fertile ground around a certain theme. And this one is, of course, the theme of dying and transition. We wanted to see if by setting it up in that way, if it dropped people into fertile ground that took them beyond their usual mindset and shifted them into new understanding about who they were and how to be consciously a part of a life transition. And it does, it's a fertile story. And that's why I think you find similar kinds of teaching about it all over the world, because it's a universal wisdom that we just put clothes onto. And so for people to commit, I've always wanted the thing, I love taking a group out on fast, but often it was frustrating because we're really just threshold guides. That's the middle part of a rite of passage. And ideally, people have done the hard work of severance before they arrive. And usually they don't, still, it's always good. It's always super important. But for the ball court, we really ask people for 6 months to a year, that you are doing the hard work of severance, of dying to who you no longer are, of making it good with your people, whatever you need to do, as if this was the last year of your life. What do you need to do to make it good and complete if you are dying when we meet during those 4 days? And it makes a difference. The people who are willing to do the hard work of the first phase of a rite of passage, which is severance, dying to what was, it makes the whole ceremony much more meaningful and long lasting. I mean, they get it in some place that I always love to hear those stories because there's such wisdom in them. Does that say enough, Trevi?
Yeah, thank you so much. So you have a new program, and it's called the Death Lunge, and it's about forgiveness, apology, and reconciliation. And I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the question of forgiveness, because for so many of us, it's such a thorny issue. You know, you go through life and there's somebody, you know, you need to forgive them. You think you ought to forgive them. You try, you take it back. You try again a different way, you take it back. So, and then, you know, there may be apologies that are shallow or forgiveness that is shallow.
Mhm.
So what's your understanding of this process? Like what makes forgiveness, what gets a person ready to forgive? And then how do you make it last?
Mhm.
How do you know when you've really done it?
Right. Well, this is again one of those topics that when we look at our generation and how we were the role modeling around forgiveness and apology in our lives and our families, we see mostly that they were pretty dysfunctional teachings, that forgiveness and apology were a lot about power. And we were not, these last generations really lost the art of what it takes in order to approach true apology and forgiveness. And so in watching people go through the Death Lodge and some people wanting to say, I forgive you, even though really they're not ready to. And more saying to people, don't do it unless you are, unless it's authentic. Instead, acknowledge where you really are with it, which might be, I'm still angry with you. So we decided to really break out that Death Lodge into a whole week of what is the natural process of moving toward forgiveness or apology, and trying to relearn the skill, because it is a skill of being able to do the work of coming to the place where when I say, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I can name and tell you what I'm sorry for. I can be very specific. I can acknowledge that I've really hurt you. And I do it without expecting that you will forgive me or not. I apologize because I've done the work of getting to where I really see what my part was. And whether you forgive me or not, that's up to you. For me, and to realize when we do it, when it's true apology, it actually has us feeling a sense of self-worth. It gives us a sense of, it feels good to do it if we're doing it authentically. But it takes the steps toward getting to that place or getting toward true forgiveness. And there's always a question, are there some things that are unforgivable? But really the first step that's sometimes the hardest for people is to acknowledge that what happened was not okay. And it never will be okay. That to forgive or to apologize does not change the fact that what happened was not okay. And a lot of people get stuck there because they say, how can I be angry or tell my parents, who I feel abused by, how can I love them? I have to love them. Of course I love them. How can I tell them that what they did is not okay and that I'm angry at them? It's like we can't. For some reason in these last generations, we can't divide that, what happened from the person. Mm-hmm. And so during that week, a lot of it, for one, is getting to the place where we can really honestly say what happened was awful, and to feel it and acknowledge it and to take it in, sit with it and know it's not going to kill us, just sit with that pain. And then to, as you talked about, Trevi, to be able to get to take the time another step is to be able to walk in that person's shoes, say, what's their story? Ask them to take me into your world so I can see, I can try to understand where you're coming from. That again, it doesn't, understanding where they come from, that they probably came from an abused family or, whatever good reason why they might have done it, they're in a bad place. It still doesn't change the fact that what happened was not okay. But to be able to walk in their shoes and say, wow, look at the world that they were coming from. And that's an important part. And also to look at ourselves and say, was there some way that I contributed to what happened? And that's a hard one too, because again, it's especially if it happened as a child, the child is never responsible for what happened, never. And yet, for a lot of times to be able to look honestly at what if I, how did I in some way set up this situation? That's an important part of it, is to be able to look at ourselves and be honest with ourselves in a way that doesn't make us out to be bad, but is being able to look at ourselves honestly and with curiosity and forgiveness, self-forgiveness. All those steps are difficult. That's just sort of a summary, but to be able to guide people during the week through that doesn't mean that it's, that may be just the beginning of the process, but to understand that there is a process that we can move through that moves us closer to being able to authentically say, I am really sorry for what I did, and to take full responsibility for that. Or I really forgive you for what you did. What you did is not okay. And yet you're not a bad person, and I love you and I forgive you, which takes, it may not change the other person, but it takes the weight off us of carrying around that anger and guilt, whatever it is that is associated with that.
It's like saying there is enough room in my psyche and my consciousness to experience not just one limited way of looking at something, but let me just expand it and see if I can bring in this part. Maybe just a little wedge of it, but just enough to say, all right, what was my participation? Or just enough openness to say, okay, I'm willing to spend a little bit of time looking at this from somebody else's point of view. It's like a little, kind of expansion of consciousness, a willingness to have it be a little bit more open and complex. And we won't die from it.
Yep, exactly. And it begins to change what, again, we often in our self-forgiveness, that's often stops us right at the beginning. And to learn how to first accept ourselves as being fallible and capable of hurting other people. And it helps us extend that. It opens our heart to being able to not have to make other people perfect. But to realize that they too are human, who make mistakes. And that's a big shift. If we can shift that inner critic into an inner witness, that's a big shift. Yeah.
So I want to conclude by asking you about Radical Joy for Hard Times, because you've been involved with Radical Joy for Hard Times yourself. You have our first flag there on the wall, our flag from 2010. And so I think it's kind of obvious from the discussion that we've been having about how the work of finding and making beauty in wounded places fits in with your work of living and dying. But just how is it that you were attracted to this work of Radical Joy for Hard Times, and what's it meant to you in your life?
Well, you made the minute I heard about what you were doing, Trebi, where I went was, oh my God, that's not to be able to learn how to be in wounded places on the land, and to come to, as you say, bring beauty, or to find that we have I love that place. Loving relationship, even though it's been harmed. Where I took it immediately was that's about learning how to do that same work with our own wounds, and how huge that is to be able to say, and I use it a lot in my guiding, talk about what you're doing, because it's to be able to sit in our wounded places, and rather than tell the story that we're bad because of it, or all the victim stories and all the ways that we in an unhealthy way, sit with our wounds and try to push them away and reject them, instead to embrace them and say, it's a part of my wholeness. That changes so much. It seems simple, but, and your wording helped me to make that seemingly simple shift of how to bring beauty to our wounded places and embrace it. It became not just a teaching for me, but I got it. You made me, I get it. And it makes a difference to other people too.
Thanks. I'm glad. And you did one really extraordinary, well, I mean, you've done several global earth exchanges, but I remember one that you did in the Owens Valley where you live, where you had an encounter with somebody who was changing the pipes. Do you want to briefly tell that story before we finish? It's such a great story.
Yeah, I went where we have the Owens Lake, which used to be a beautiful big lake in the valley, and the Department of Water and Power in LA came and illegally bought up land that had water on it and completely drained the lake so that it became alkali dust, the worst pollutant in the country. And it affected Stephen's lungs a lot, affected a lot of asthma in the valley. And so that obviously was the place that I went, the wounded place that I always avoid. I would get so angry every time I would drive past that lake. So I went and took a walk on the lake for the day and began to find that there were beautiful little plants and little insects that were living in these tiny little pools of water. DWP was, the courts told them they had to begin to put a little bit of water on to hold the dust down. It didn't really work, but so there are little pockets of water, and I began to see life in it and beauty in it. You helped me drop to that place of seeing the wholeness of that lake. And then I was walking further, and one of the trucks came of the people who maintain the lake. Or maintain the dry lake. And of course, they're the enemy. They're the ones who are taking the water away and bringing the pollutant. And as it began to get closer and closer to me, I thought, what am I going to do with this? Like, I'm angry at them. And then as they got closer, I found myself just like waving, just acknowledging them as a part of the extension of where you helped me go. And they big smile on his face, and he waved back. And it was like, I knew at that moment that he knew he was being seen as the enemy, that he got that a lot. And he was just a human being. And it was being able to extend that not just to the lake, but to the person who I identified as perpetuating the sickness was healing for me.
Yeah, and I mean, so simple, like a wave like that, and it changed something for you. It changed something for him. It changed your relationship to the place. It's really beautiful. Just that simple. Yeah. Well, we have to stop, Meredith. It's been so wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Trevi, always.
And we're going to have next January 11th. We will be talking to, or is it the 18th? It's the 18th. January the 18th, we're going to be talking to Laura Schmidt, who's one of the co-founders of the Good Grief Network, which has had a huge impact on lots and lots of people over the last few years, helping them to deal with grief, especially climate grief. So hope everybody will come and join us for that. And Meredith Little Foster, thank you for your work, for all of these many decades that continues in ways that are just constantly unfolding, and for being such an inspiring force in the lives of so many.
Back at you, Trevi.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And now it's time for the Earth Exchange Cafe to close. So if you've finished your coffee and tea and your cocoa, and you can push back your chairs and get ready to leave this warm and intimate and welcoming place. And we will see you next month on January 18th. Thank you for being with us today. And we will look forward to having Harriet back next month as well.
Love you, Treb.
Love you too.